The sun hung merciless in the bleached sky above Redemption Creek, a town that seemed to have been forgotten by God himself. Red dust swirled through the main street, coating everything in a fine layer of rust-colored grit that no amount of scrubbing could ever fully remove. The wooden buildings, weathered and warped by years of scorching heat and bitter winters, leaned against each other like drunken men stumbling out of Murphy's saloon at closing time. Margaret Sullivan stood on the porch of the general store, her calloused hands gripping a basket of laundry she'd just finished for the banker's wife. At 26, she was still young, though the harsh prairie life had already begun etching fine lines around her green eyes. Her auburn hair, once her pride, was now always pulled back in a severe bun, hidden beneath a faded bonnet. She'd learned that beauty was a luxury a widow couldn't afford in a place like Redemption Creek. 2 years had passed since they'd lowered Thomas into the hard ground of the cemetery on Boot Hill. 2 years since she'd become the town's object of pity and scorn in equal measure. Thomas Sullivan had been many things. Charming, handsome, full of grand dreams, but he'd also been weak for cards and whiskey. When they found him face down in Bitter Creek with a bullet in his back and empty pockets, nobody was particularly surprised. The only surprise was that he'd left behind a pretty young wife with no family, no money, and no prospects. "Morning, Mrs. Sullivan," called out Mrs. Henderson from across the street, though her tone held none of the warmth the greeting might suggest. The banker's wife made a show of gathering her skirts higher than necessary as she stepped around a pile of horse droppings, as if poverty might be contagious. Margaret nodded silently, having learned that responses only invited further conversation, and conversations in Redemption Creek rarely ended well for her. She shifted the heavy basket to her hip and began the long walk back to her small cabin on the outskirts of town. The other women watched from behind curtained windows, their whispers following her like tumbleweeds in the wind. The cabin sat lonely against the vast expanse of scorched grassland, its unpainted boards silver gray from exposure. It wasn't much, 2 rooms with a leaking roof and gaps in the walls that let in the winter wind, but it was hers, as long as she could keep up with the rent. Anyway, she pushed through the door and set the basket down, her back aching from the morning's labor. 50 cents for a full day's washing. At this rate, she'd have just enough for rent and cornmeal, with nothing left over for the new shoes she desperately needed. She was heating water for coffee, if the weak brew of used grounds could still be called that, when she heard it, the thunder of hooves, too many to be the regular stage or a passing traveler. Margaret moved to the window, peering through the dusty glass. They came from the north, riding hard, a dust cloud announcing their arrival long before she could make out individual riders, even from a distance. She could tell these weren't ordinary travelers. There was something in the way they sat their horses, casual yet alert, dangerous yet unhurried. As they drew closer, her breath caught. She counted 8 men, all armed, their faces obscured by trail dust and the shadows of their wide-brimmed hats. The Garrison Gang. Even in isolated Redemption Creek, their reputation preceded them like a dark storm cloud. Led by Jake Garrison, they'd carved a bloody path through 3 territories, robbing banks, holding up stages, and leaving more than a few dead men in their wake. The newspapers called Garrison a cold-blooded killer. The dime novels painted him as a romantic figure, a gentleman bandit who tipped his hat to ladies even as he relieved them of their jewels. Margaret pressed herself against the wall, hoping they'd pass by without stopping. But hope, she'd learned, was another luxury she couldn't afford. The gang slowed as they entered town, their horses' hooves raising small clouds of dust with each step. Through her window, she watched them fan out along Main Street like they owned it, and for all intents and purposes, they did. She could see Sheriff Watson standing in his doorway, his hand notably nowhere near his gun. The old lawman had survived too long to play hero now. The riders stopped in front of Murphy's saloon, dismounting with the easy grace of men accustomed to long hours in the saddle. All except one. The man she assumed must be Jake Garrison remained mounted, surveying the town like a king reviewing his holdings. Even from this distance, she could see he was different from the others. younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with a lean build that spoke of coiled strength rather than brute force. When he finally swung down from his black stallion, it was with an almost lazy elegance that seemed at odds with his fearsome reputation. Margaret knew she should stay hidden, should wait until they'd drunk their fill and moved on. But she needed to collect her payment from Mrs. Henderson, and waiting might mean the difference between eating tonight or going hungry. She grabbed her shawl, wrapping it tight around her shoulders as if the thin fabric could provide protection from more than just the sun. The walk to town had never seemed longer. She kept her head down, moving quickly but not so fast as to draw attention. The streets were eerily quiet, townsfolk having suddenly remembered urgent business that kept them indoors. Only the gang remained on the street, some already disappearing into the saloon while others lounged against the hitching posts, passing a bottle between them. She was almost to the bank when it happened. A gust of wind, stronger than usual, caught her bonnet and sent it tumbling across the dusty street. Without thinking, she started after it, then froze as it came to rest directly in front of the saloon entrance. "Allow me, ma'am." The voice was smooth, cultured even, with just a hint of a southern drawl. Jake Garrison bent to retrieve her bonnet, brushing the dust from it with surprising care. Up close, she could see his face clearly, sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw roughened by several days' worth of stubble, and eyes the color of winter sky. Dangerous eyes, she thought, that seemed to see right through her carefully maintained facade of invisibility. He held out the bonnet, and she had no choice but to step forward to take it. Their fingers brushed for just an instant, and she felt an unexpected jolt, like the static before a storm. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. His lips curved in what might have been a smile, though it didn't quite reach those cold eyes. "Jake Garrison, at your service." He touched the brim of his hat in a mockery of gentlemanly behavior. "And you are." She should have mumbled something and hurried away. Should have played the meek widow, invisible and unimportant. Instead, she found herself straightening her spine, meeting his gaze directly. "Someone who minds her own business. Mr. Garrison, I suggest you do the same." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or amusement. The men behind him had gone quiet, waiting to see how their leader would handle this unexpected defiance. "Brave words for a woman alone," he said softly. Taking a step closer, she could smell leather and gunpowder, the scent of danger itself. Or perhaps foolish ones. "Perhaps," she agreed, her heart hammering against her ribs. "But then, I've found there's little difference between bravery and foolishness in a place like this." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze traveling from her worn boots to her mended dress to the determined set of her jaw. "You're Thomas Sullivan's widow." It wasn't a question. Of course he knew. Men like Jake Garrison made it their business to know everything about the towns they visited. "I'm my own woman now," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "Are you now?" His smile widened, becoming something predatory. "How refreshing." He circled her slowly, like a wolf studying prey, and she forced herself to remain still. The other gang members watched with interest, some already making crude wagers on what would happen next. "Your husband owed money to some friends of mine," Garrison said conversationally. "Quite a substantial sum. Actually, they were very disappointed when he turned up dead without paying his debts." Margaret's blood ran cold. She'd known Thomas gambled, but she'd never imagined. "Whatever debts my husband had died with him," she said, proud that her voice remained steady. "Perhaps, perhaps not." He stopped directly in front of her again, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "The question is, what's a man to do with such a complicated situation?" The threat hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear. Margaret felt the weight of the town's eyes upon them, watching from behind windows and doorways. None would help her. She was on her own, as always. "You'll do what men like you always do," she said quietly. "Take what you want and move on, leaving destruction in your wake." His eyebrows rose slightly. Men like me? Outlaws, criminals, men who've forgotten what it means to be human. The silence that followed was deafening. One of the gang members whistled low and long, clearly impressed by her audacity, or stupidity. At this point, Margaret wasn't sure there was a difference. Garrison's hand moved to rest on the butt of his pistol, a casual gesture that nonetheless made her breath catch. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a rich, genuine sound that transformed his face entirely. "You know what I think?" he said, leaning in close enough that his breath stirred the loose tendrils of hair at her temple. "I think you're the first interesting thing I've found in this godforsaken town." He straightened and stepped back, giving her room to breathe again. "We'll be staying a few days. I'm sure we'll have occasion to continue this enlightening conversation." It was a dismissal and a promise rolled into one. Margaret clutched her bonnet with trembling fingers, her moment of defiance suddenly feeling very costly. "You'll regret this," she warned, the words escaping before she could stop them. He was already turning away, but he paused to look back at her over his shoulder. The smile that curved his lips was sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous. "Perhaps," he said, echoing her earlier words. "But then again, I've found regret to be a luxury men like me can't afford." The outlaw only smiled, touching the brim of his hat once more before sauntering into the saloon, leaving Margaret standing alone in the dusty street with the weight of too many eyes upon her and the certainty that her carefully ordered world had just tilted off its axis. As she finally made it to the bank to collect her meager payment, her hands shook so badly she could barely sign the receipt. "Mrs." Henderson paid her without meeting her eyes, clearly having witnessed the entire exchange from the bank window. Walking home, Margaret's mind raced. She'd drawn the attention of the most dangerous man in 3 territories, challenged him publicly, and lived to tell about it. For now. But men like Jake Garrison didn't forget slights, especially from women who should know their place. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked disturbingly like blood. Margaret quickened her pace, eager to reach the relative safety of her cabin. But even as she barred the door behind her and checked the load in Thomas's old rifle, she knew that safety was just another illusion. Jake Garrison had smiled at her warning. That smile would haunt her dreams tonight. She was certain, because behind the charm and the dangerous beauty of it, she'd seen something that terrified her more than any threat: interest. And in her experience, when men like Jake Garrison took an interest in something or someone, it rarely ended well. The inside of Murphy's saloon was thick with smoke and the sour smell of spilled whiskey. Margaret pushed through the swinging doors, her jaw set with determination despite the trembling in her hands. She'd spent 3 sleepless nights jumping at every sound, waiting for Jake Garrison to make good on his implied threats, when nothing happened. She'd decided she couldn't hide forever. She needed work, and Murphy sometimes hired her to clean the saloon in the early mornings before the drinking started in earnest. The usual crowd of afternoon drinkers fell silent as she entered. Cowboys, drifters, and townsmen alike turned to stare, their expressions ranging from surprise to disapproval. Respectable women didn't enter saloons, especially not when the Garrison gang had claimed it as their temporary headquarters. She spotted them immediately. Impossible to miss. Really, they'd commandeered the best table near the back, playing cards with the lazy confidence of men who had nowhere else to be. Jake Garrison sat facing the door, because of course he did. Men like him always kept their backs to the wall and their eyes on potential threats. He looked up from his cards as she approached the bar, and she felt the weight of his gaze like a physical touch. Today he wore a black vest over a white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle. His gun belt hung low on his hips, the pearl-handled Colts gleaming in the lamplight. "Mrs. Sullivan." Murphy's voice was strained as she reached the bar. The Irish saloon keeper looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past 3 days. "This ain't a good time. I need work, Mr. Murphy," she said quietly, keeping her eyes fixed on the barkeeper rather than the table behind her. You mentioned last week that you needed help with the cleaning. Murphy's eyes darted nervously to the back table. That was before. I mean, things have changed. Indeed they have. The smooth voice came from directly behind her. Margaret's spine stiffened, but she didn't turn around. She could smell that distinctive scent again. Leather, gunpowder, and something else. Something wild and dangerous. The lady needs work, Jake Garrison continued, moving to stand beside her at the bar. Surely you're not going to turn away such an industrious citizen. Murphy? The barkeeper swallowed hard. No, sir, Mr. Garrison. Of course not. Excellent. Garrison signaled for a bottle, then turned to Margaret. Join me for a drink, Mrs. Sullivan. We can discuss your employment opportunities. I don't drink with outlaws, she said, finally meeting his eyes. His smile was sharp and amused. No? What do you do with outlaws, then? Avoid them, when possible. And when it's not possible, she lifted her chin. Endure them. He laughed. That same rich sound that seemed so at odds with his reputation. Several of his men looked up from their cards, clearly surprised by their leader's good humor. You're either very brave or very foolish, he said, echoing his words from their first encounter. You said that before. I'm beginning to think you have a limited vocabulary, Mr. Garrison. His eyes narrowed slightly, but the smile remained. Oh, I assure you, my vocabulary is quite extensive. Would you like a demonstration? The innuendo was clear, and Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, around them. The saloon patrons watched with the fascinated horror usually reserved for public hangings. What I'd like, she said carefully, is to discuss employment with Mr. Murphy and then leave, peacefully. Peacefully? He tested the word like he was tasting wine. How disappointingly mundane, and here I thought you were interesting. The dismissal stung more than it should have. Margaret turned back to Murphy. When would you like me to start? That is... The barkeeper looked helplessly between her and Garrison. Tomorrow morning. Garrison answered for him. 5 o'clock sharp. The boys do make quite a mess. He leaned against the bar, studying her with those winter blue eyes. Of course, you'll need to be careful. Dangerous men frequent this establishment. I've noticed, she said dryly. Have you? Good. Awareness is the first step toward survival. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, sliding one toward her. You sure about that drink? Quite sure. Pity. He threw back his own glass in one smooth motion. Tell me, Mrs. Sullivan, what would you do if I insisted? The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Margaret could feel the tension in the room ratcheting up, everyone waiting to see how far he would push, how much he would take. I suppose, she said slowly, you'd have to decide whether forcing a woman to drink with you would enhance your reputation or diminish it. After all, where's the victory in compelling what should be freely given? Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or respect. You're playing a dangerous game, Mrs. Sullivan. I'm not playing at anything, Mr. Garrison. I'm trying to earn enough money to eat and keep a roof over my head. That's not a game. That's survival. Everything's a game, he countered. The only question is whether you know the rules. And what are the rules here? He leaned closer, close enough that she could see the faint scar that ran through his left eyebrow. Rule 1, don't challenge men who have nothing to lose. Rule 2, don't make threats you can't follow through on. And Rule 3, his voice dropped to a whisper meant only for her. Never, ever, tell a man like me that he'll regret something. It sounds too much like a promise. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to remain still. And if I've already broken all 3 rules, then I'd say you're either the bravest woman I've ever met, or you have a death wish. He straightened, his public smile sliding back into place. Either way, you've certainly livened up my stay in this dusty little town. Behind him, one of his men, a brutal-looking fellow with a scar that ran from ear to chin, called out, Boss, you gonna let her talk to you like that? Garrison didn't even turn around. "Tell me, Henley, when was the last time anyone surprised you?" The scarred man thought for a moment. "Can't rightly say." "Exactly. We've robbed banks, held up stages, outrun passes from here to Mexico. It all becomes rather predictable. But this," he gestured to Margaret, "this is unexpected, and I find myself curious to see how it plays out." "You'll regret this," Margaret said again, the words coming out before she could stop them. The outlaw only smiled, wider this time, showing teeth. "There you go again with the promises. Mrs. Sullivan? Careful, or I might start to think you're sweet on me." The crude laughter from his men finally broke through her composure. Margaret felt her face burn with humiliation and anger. She turned to leave, but his hand shot out, catching her wrist. His grip was firm but not painful, his thumb resting against her pulse point where he could undoubtedly feel her heart racing. "Tomorrow morning," he said softly. 5 o'clock. Don't be late." She jerked her hand free. "I don't take orders from you." "No? Then consider it a suggestion, a strongly worded suggestion." "Is that a threat? Do I need to threaten you, Mrs. Sullivan?" They stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills while the entire saloon held its breath. Finally, Margaret took a step back. 5 o'clock, she agreed, hating herself for the capitulation. "See, that wasn't so hard." He picked up the untouched glass of whiskey she'd refused and raised it in a mock toast. "To new beginnings." Margaret turned and walked toward the door, her back straight despite the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. She'd almost reached the swinging doors when his voice stopped her. "Oh, and Mrs. Sullivan? Wear something pretty tomorrow. All that black doesn't suit you." The laughter followed her out into the street, where the late afternoon sun did nothing to warm the chill that had settled into her bones. She walked quickly, aware of faces peering at her from windows and doorways. By tomorrow, everyone in Redemption Creek would know about her confrontation with Jake Garrison. They'd whisper about the widow Sullivan, who'd already buried one no-good man and seemed determined to attract another. Let them talk, she thought fiercely. They'd been talking about her for 2 years anyway. But as she reached her lonely cabin and barred the door behind her, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just made a terrible mistake. Jake Garrison was no ordinary outlaw. There was intelligence in those cold blue eyes, a calculating mind behind the charming smile. He was playing some sort of game with her, and she didn't understand the rules or the stakes. She moved to the small mirror above her washstand, studying her reflection. Was she pretty, as he'd implied? She'd been once, perhaps, before grief and hardship had carved lines around her eyes and thinned her face, before she'd learned to hide her beauty like a shameful secret, knowing it would only bring trouble. Now trouble had found her anyway, in the form of a smiling outlaw who seemed to see right through her carefully constructed defenses. "You'll regret this," she whispered to her reflection, unsure whether she was talking about Jake Garrison or herself. In the distance, a coyote howled, the sound lonely and wild in the gathering darkness. Margaret shivered and reached for Thomas's old rifle. Checking the load for the 3rd time, she had a feeling she wouldn't be sleeping much tonight. Tomorrow she would have to face Jake Garrison again, this time on his territory, surrounded by his men. The sensible thing would be to pack what little she owned and leave town tonight. But where would she go? She had no money, no family, nowhere to run. Besides, running would mean letting him win. And despite everything, despite the danger and the stupidity of it all, Margaret Sullivan had discovered she still had some pride left. She just hoped it wouldn't get her killed. The pre-dawn darkness was absolute as Margaret made her way to Murphy's saloon, her worn boots crunching on the frost-hardened dirt. She'd barely slept, starting at every creak of the cabin walls, every whisper of wind through the gaps. Now, moving through the empty streets, she felt like the only living soul in a ghost town. She'd defied Garrison's suggestion about her clothing, wearing the same black dress she always wore, cleaned and mended, but still unmistakably the garment of a woman in mourning. Let him make of that what he would. The saloon was dark when she arrived, but the door swung open at her touch. Inside, A single lamp burned on the bar, casting dancing shadows across the empty room. The smell of stale smoke and spilled whiskey was even stronger in the pre-dawn quiet. Punctual. I appreciate that in a woman. Margaret's heart leaped into her throat. Jake Garrison sat at the same back table, a cup of coffee steaming in front of him. He was alone, which somehow made him seem more dangerous than when surrounded by his gang. "I came to work," she said, proud that her voice remained steady. "Where are the cleaning supplies?" "Behind the bar, but first, coffee." He gestured to the pot sitting on the small stove Murphy kept in the corner. "It's going to be a long morning." "I didn't come here to socialize, Mr. Garrison." "No, you came because you need the money, and I'm here because I find you intriguing." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with those unsettling blue eyes. "Tell me about your husband." The question caught her off guard. "Thomas is dead. There's nothing to tell." "Oh, I think there's plenty to tell. Man doesn't end up face down in Bitter Creek over a friendly game of cards." Margaret busied herself finding the mop and bucket, using the activity to avoid his gaze. "My husband's poor choices died with him." "Did they? Because from what I hear, Thomas Sullivan owed money to half the territory when he died, including some very unforgiving people. As I told you before, his debts aren't mine. Legally? Perhaps not, but men like Big Jack Thornton don't much care about legal niceties." Garrison sipped his coffee, watching her over the rim. "He's been asking about you, wondering if the pretty widow might be convinced to work off her husband's debt in other ways." Margaret's hand stilled on the mop handle. She'd heard of Big Jack Thornton. Everyone had. He ran a string of establishments across the territory, the kind where women worked off debts in ways that didn't bear thinking about. "If you're trying to frighten me, I'm trying to educate you." Garrison stood, moving toward her with that predatory grace she'd noticed before. "You think I'm your biggest problem? I'm the least of your worries. Mrs. Sullivan. Then why are you here? Why this interest in me?" He stopped just out of arm's reach, his head tilted as if considering the question. "Would you believe me if I said I don't know?" "No. Smart woman." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say I have a weakness for lost causes. And you, Margaret Sullivan, are about as lost as they come." The use of her first name sent an unexpected shiver through her. "I'm not lost. I know exactly where I am." "Do you? Alone in a saloon with a wanted man? In a town that would sell you to the highest bidder without blinking? That doesn't sound like someone who knows where they are. That sounds like someone who's run out of options." Margaret gripped the mop handle tighter, using it like a barrier between them. "What do you want from me? Now that's the question, isn't it?" He moved closer, and she backed up until she hit the bar. "What do I want from the brave widow who dares to warn me about regret? Stop playing games." "But I like games. They make life interesting." He braced his hands on the bar, one on either side of her, effectively caging her in. "Tell me, Margaret, do I frighten you?" The correct answer was yes. Every instinct screamed at her to agree, to placate him, to survive. Instead, she lifted her chin and met his gaze directly. "You want to frighten me, but what you really do is annoy me." He blinked, clearly not expecting that response. Then he laughed, stepping back to give her space. "Annoy you? I've been called many things, but annoying isn't usually one of them. First time for everything." "Indeed." He returned to his table, picking up his coffee. "Well then, by all means, get to work. I'd hate to annoy you further by preventing you from earning your wages." Margaret spent the next hour scrubbing floors and wiping tables, intensely aware of his presence. He didn't speak again, just sat there drinking coffee and occasionally dealing cards to himself. The silence was almost worse than conversation, filled with unspoken tension. As the first pale light of dawn crept through the windows, she heard horses outside, the rest of the Garrison gang, returning from whatever nighttime activities they'd been pursuing. They burst through the doors in high spirits, laughing and passing a bottle between them. "Well, well," said Henley, the scarred one from yesterday. "Look who's here bright and early." Leave her be, Garrison said mildly, not looking up from his cards. Just being friendly, boss. Henley moved closer to Margaret, reeking of whiskey and trail dust. Ain't often we get such pretty company. I said leave her be. This time there was steel in Garrison's voice. Henley backed off, hands raised in mock surrender. Sure, boss. Whatever you say. The others settled around various tables, calling for bottles and breakfast. Margaret tried to continue working, but she could feel their eyes following her every movement. The comments started low-whispered jokes and crude observations, but grew bolder as more whiskey was consumed. Bet she's lonely, being a widow and all. Might be we could help with that. Thomas Sullivan was a fool, but at least he had good taste. Margaret's face burned, but she kept her head down, focusing on her work. She'd endured worse from the so-called respectable citizens of Redemption Creek. Then someone grabbed her wrist as she passed, a younger member of the gang with mean eyes and whiskey on his breath. How about a kiss for luck, pretty lady? Before she could react, before she could even open her mouth to protest, there was a blur of movement. The young outlaw was suddenly on the floor, blood streaming from his nose, and Jake Garrison was standing over him with a look that could freeze hell itself. Touch her again, Garrison said softly, and I'll kill you. The saloon went dead silent. The younger man scrambled backward. One hand pressed to his bleeding nose. I didn't mean nothing, boss. Just having some fun. Find your fun elsewhere. Garrison's voice was calm, conversational even, which somehow made it more terrifying. In fact, why don't you all find somewhere else to be for a while? I'm sure there's trouble to be made somewhere in this town. The gang filed out quickly, shooting nervous glances between their leader and Margaret. When the last of them had gone, Garrison turned to her. You're welcome, he said dryly. I didn't ask for your protection. No, but you needed it. He flexed his hand, knuckles already showing the marks of impact. My men are many things, but gentleman isn't one of them. Neither are you. True, but I have my own code. He moved back to his table, settling into his chair with that lazy grace. Sit with me. I have work to finish. Murphy won't be here for another hour. Sit. It wasn't a request. Margaret set down her cleaning supplies and reluctantly took the chair across from him. Up close, she could see the violence barely leashed beneath his controlled exterior. This won't work, she said quietly. Whatever game you're playing, whatever you think you're doing, it won't work. I'm not some saloon girl to be won or conquered. I know exactly what you are. His eyes were intense, seeing too much. You're a survivor. Like me. We're nothing alike. Aren't we? Both of us making our way in a world that would rather see us dead. Both of us refusing to bend, even when bending would be easier. He leaned forward. Tell me you don't feel it. This connection between us. What I feel, Margaret said carefully, is trapped. You've made me a target simply by paying attention to me. Your men will talk, the town will talk, and my reputation, what's left of it, will be destroyed. Your reputation was destroyed the day your husband died, owing money to half the territory. The brutal honesty of it stung. Then what do you want from me? If I'm already ruined, what possible interest could I hold? He was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she couldn't read. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, rougher, more honest. When I was 15, I watched my family's farm burn, watched everything I knew turn to ash because we couldn't pay the mortgage. The bank took it all, sold it to a cattle baron who wanted our water rights. His fingers traced patterns on the scarred wood of the table. I swore that day I'd never be powerless again. Never let anyone take from me what was mine. So you became what you hated. A taker, perhaps. Or perhaps I just learned to play by the real rules. He met her eyes again. You haven't learned that yet. You're still trying to live by the rules of a world that doesn't exist. A world where hard work is rewarded and good women are protected. And you're going to teach me different? I'm going to offer you a choice. He leaned back, the moment of vulnerability passing. Big Jack Thornton will come for you eventually. When he does, you can face him alone, or you can be under my protection." "Your protection?" Margaret laughed bitterly. "And what would that cost me?" "Everything," he said simply. "But you'd be alive, and free. That's more than Thornton would offer." The sound of footsteps on the boardwalk broke the moment. Murphy had arrived, keys jangling as he unlocked the front door properly. The barkeeper took one look at them, sitting together, and paled. "Morning, Murphy," Garrison said pleasantly. "Mrs. Sullivan has done excellent work. I trust you'll compensate her accordingly." "Yes, sir, of course." Margaret stood, needing to put distance between herself and the unsettling truths Garrison had spoken. "I'll be going now. Think about what I said." Garrison shuffled his cards, not looking at her. "The offer won't stand forever." She left without responding, stepping out into a morning that seemed too bright after the dimness of the saloon. But as she walked home, his words echoed in her mind. Was he right? Was she clinging to rules that no longer applied? Trying to live in a world that had ceased to exist the moment Thomas died, and more troubling still, why did part of her want to accept his offer? The thunder of hooves and gunfire shattered the afternoon quiet. Margaret dropped the washing she'd been hanging and ran to her window, heart pounding. Through the dusty glass, she could see riders racing down Main Street, the Garrison gang in full flight. Behind them, a cloud of dust marked their pursuers. The Wells Fargo gold shipment. She'd heard whispers about it in town. 20,000 in gold coins bound for the bank in Denver. Everyone knew it was coming through, but no one thought anyone would be foolish enough to try for it. Not with the extra guards, not in broad daylight. But then, Jake Garrison had never been one to follow conventional wisdom. The shooting intensified, the crack of rifles mixing with the deeper boom of shotguns. Margaret watched as the gang split up. Some heading north toward the Badlands, others circling back through town. It was chaos, carefully orchestrated chaos, and the guards didn't know which group to follow. Then she saw him, Jake Garrison, on his black stallion, riding hard straight toward her cabin. Blood darkened his left sleeve, and his face was grim beneath the shadow of his hat. He was alone, separated from his men, and he was coming for her. "No," she whispered, backing away from the window. "No, no, no!" But it was too late. He was already sliding from his horse, already pushing through her door without knocking. He stood there, breathing hard, gun in hand, blood dripping steadily onto her clean floor. "Get your things," he said without preamble. "We need to go." "I'm not going anywhere with you." "You don't have a choice." He moved to the window, peering out through the curtains. "My men will lead them north. Buy us some time. But they'll figure it out soon enough. And when they do, they'll come here." "Why would they?" "Because the whole town saw my interest in you. They'll think you know something, think you were part of it." He turned to face her, and she could see the pain etched in the tight lines around his mouth. "They'll arrest you, Margaret, or worse. I'll tell them the truth. I had nothing to do with—" "You think they'll care about truth? A woman alone, already gossiped about, connected to a known outlaw?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "They'll hang you just to say they got someone." The worst part was, she knew he was right. She'd seen frontier justice before, seen how quickly fear and anger could turn a town into a mob. "Where would we go?" "Mountains first. There's a place—" He swayed slightly, and she noticed the blood was coming faster now, dripping from his fingertips. "Get what you need, only what you can carry." Margaret stood frozen for a moment, her orderly world crashing down around her. Then practicality took over. She grabbed her carpet bag and began throwing things in. A change of clothes, what little money she had saved, the photograph of her parents, Thomas's gun. "There's a medical kit in my saddlebags," Garrison said, his voice strained. "I'm going to need you to—" He didn't finish. His knees buckled, and he slumped against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor. His gun fell from nerveless fingers. Margaret dropped her bag and knelt beside him. Up close, she could see the bullet wound, high on his left shoulder. The blood was coming too fast, soaking through his shirt and vest. "You're hurt worse than you're letting on." "Noticed that, did you?" He tried for his usual sardonic smile, but couldn't quite manage it. "Always were too smart for your own good." She should leave him. Run out the door and keep running. Let fate take its course. He was an outlaw, a killer, a man who'd brought nothing but trouble into her life. But looking at him now, pale and bleeding on her floor, she saw something else. A man in pain, a human being who would die without her help. "Can you stand? We need to get that shirt off." "Leave me. Take my horse and—" "Shut up." She helped him struggle out of his vest and shirt, trying not to think about the intimacy of it. The wound was ugly, but clean. The bullet had passed through. "You're lucky. No bones broken. Looks like it missed anything vital." "Don't feel lucky," he muttered. She worked quickly, using skills learned from helping her mother tend injuries back when she was young. The bleeding slowed under pressure, and she packed the wound with clean cloth. All the while, she could hear activity in the town, shouts and horses. "They're getting organized," Garrison said, his eyes clearer now that the immediate crisis had passed. "We need to move. You need rest." "I need to not be here when they arrive." He struggled to his feet, jaw clenched against the pain. "Help me to my horse." Margaret knew it was madness, knew she should refuse, should save herself. Instead, she found herself supporting his weight, helping him outside. His black stallion stood patient, trained not to wander. "Can you ride? I've ridden in worse shape." He pulled himself into the saddle with obvious effort. "Get your things. And Margaret, change into something practical. We'll be riding hard." She ran back inside, stripping off her black dress and pulling on an old riding skirt she'd kept from better days. The carpetbag went behind his saddle, and then she was up behind him, arms around his waist to keep him steady. "Where are we going?" "Away." He spurred the horse into motion, heading not north like his gang, but west toward the mountains. "There's a cabin, old trapper's place. We can hold up there until—" He swayed in the saddle, and Margaret tightened her grip. "Stay conscious, you hear me? Don't you dare fall off this horse." "Bossy," he murmured. "I like that about you." They rode hard, putting distance between themselves and Redemption Creek. The mountains loomed ahead, purple shadows in the afternoon sun. Behind them, no sign of pursuit yet. But it would come. She knew it would come. The trail grew rougher, winding up through stands of pine and aspen. The horse labored under their combined weight, and Garrison slumped forward more with each mile. Margaret could feel the wet warmth of blood against her arms where she held him. "How much farther?" "Not sure." His voice was thick, drowsy. "Look for a lightning-struck pine. Trail cuts off there." She spotted it just as the sun was beginning to sink toward the peaks. The trail was barely visible, overgrown and clearly long abandoned. They followed it up, until finally a small cabin appeared, tucked into a grove of trees. It wasn't much. One room with a stone fireplace and a lean-to for horses. But it had a roof and walls, and right now that seemed like luxury. Margaret half fell from the horse, then helped Garrison down. He was barely conscious, leaning heavily against her as she got him inside. There was an old cot in the corner, and she eased him onto it. His skin was clammy, too pale, and the bandage was soaked through with blood. "Need to check the wound," she said, though she wasn't sure he could hear her anymore. She worked by feel in the growing darkness, finding a lamp and matches, coaxing a fire to life in the fireplace. In the flickering light, she unwrapped the bloody bandages. The wound was still seeping, though slower now. She cleaned it as best she could with what was available. Whiskey from his saddlebag serving as antiseptic. He groaned when the alcohol hit the wound, eyes fluttering open. "Trying to finish what the guard started? Trying to save your worthless life." She rewrapped the wound with strips torn from her petticoat, though I'm not sure why. "Because you're a good woman." His hand caught hers, surprisingly strong. "Too good for the likes of me." "Don't!" She pulled her hand free. "Don't try to charm me. Not now. Not charm. Truth." His eyes were fever bright in the firelight. "Should have left you alone. Should have ridden through without stopping. But I saw you that first day, standing in that dusty street with your chin up and fire in your eyes. And I couldn't what? Couldn't look away." He laughed weakly. The great Jake Garrison, brought low by a widow's defiance. Margaret busied herself tending the fire, unable to process the emotions his words stirred. "You need rest. And water. When's the last time you ate?" "Can't remember." She found hardtack and jerky in his saddlebags, along with a canteen. She helped him sit up enough to drink, trying not to notice the way the firelight played across the planes of his face, the vulnerability in his expression. "Why did you come for me?" she asked quietly. "You could have escaped easily on your own." He was quiet for so long she thought he'd fallen asleep. Then, "Because I've taken enough in my life, figured maybe it was time to try saving something instead." "I don't need saving." "No?" He met her eyes, and she saw understanding there. "We all need saving from something. Margaret, question is whether we're brave enough to accept it when it's offered." The wind picked up outside, whistling through the gaps in the walls. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, answered by another. They were alone here, truly alone, with the night falling and danger all around. Margaret added more wood to the fire and settled in to keep watch. Jake Garrison had saved her from the noose. That much was certain. Whatever came next, whatever price she'd pay for accepting his help, would have to wait for tomorrow. For now. She would tend his wounds and keep the fire burning and try not to think about how his words had lodged themselves in her heart like bullets of their own. "Margaret?" His voice was drowsy, already half asleep. "Yes?" "Thank you." She didn't answer. Couldn't answer, because what could she say? That she was grateful to be here, hiding in a mountain cabin with a wounded outlaw. That despite everything, despite the danger and the madness of it all, she felt more alive than she had in years? No, some truths were better left unspoken, especially in the dark, with the wolves calling and the fire casting shadows that looked too much like the ghosts of choices made and unmade. The sandstorm came without warning on their third day in the mountains. Margaret had ventured out to gather firewood when the sky turned an ominous yellow-brown. Within minutes, the wind was howling like a living thing, driving sand and grit with enough force to strip skin. She stumbled back toward the cabin, eyes squeezed nearly shut, one arm raised to protect her face. The world had become a brown void, directionless and terrifying. She could have been 10 feet from shelter or 100. There was no way to tell. "Margaret!" Jake's voice, barely audible over the wind's fury. She turned toward it, fighting against the gale that threatened to knock her down. Then his hand caught hers, strong despite his injury, pulling her forward. Together they staggered the last few yards to the cabin, falling through the door in a tangle of limbs. He slammed it shut behind them, bracing his good shoulder against the wood as the wind tried to tear it from its hinges. Sand seeped through every crack and gap, already forming small drifts on the floor. "You shouldn't be up," Margaret gasped, spitting grit. "Your wound will heal." He guided her to the cot, hands surprisingly gentle as he helped her sit. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, though her exposed skin stung from the sand's assault. "How did you know I was out there?" "Saw the storm coming. When you didn't return." He moved to stuff rags into the largest gaps around the door and windows. Each movement was careful, controlled, but she could see the pain it cost him. "Let me do that. I'm not an invalid." "No, you're a stubborn fool who'll tear his stitches if he's not careful." Despite her protests, he continued his work, and she found herself watching the play of muscles across his back. 3 days of close quarters had worn away some of the barriers between them. She'd seen him at his weakest, fevered and rambling in the night. He'd seen her frightened, exhausted, pushed to her limits. "This could last hours," he said finally, sinking onto a wooden crate that served as their only chair. "Maybe days." Margaret looked around their small shelter. The firewood she'd gathered earlier would last perhaps through the night. Their food was running low, and the storm would make hunting impossible. "We'll manage," she said with more confidence than she felt. "Will we?" His eyes found hers across the dim space. "Tell me, Margaret Sullivan, do you regret coming with me yet?" It was the question that had hung between them since they'd arrived. She'd had plenty of time to think about it, watching him sleep, tending his wound, sharing the enforced intimacy of their situation. "Ask me when the storm passes." He smiled at that, the expression transforming his face. Without the cold mask he wore for the world, he looked younger, more vulnerable, more human. "Fair enough." He pulled out a deck of cards from his pocket. "Know how to play poker? My husband was a gambler." "What do you think?" "I think you probably know more than you let on about a lot of things." They played cards while the storm raged, using dried beans as stakes. Margaret won more hands than she lost, which seemed to amuse him greatly. "You're bluffing," he said during one hand, studying her over his cards. "Perhaps. That little crease appears between your eyebrows when you're bluffing." She immediately smoothed her expression. "Does not. Does too. Right. There." He reached across to touch the spot with one finger. The contact electric in the small space. Margaret forgot to breathe. They were sitting too close. The cot and crate drawn near the fire for warmth. She could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes, the faint stubble on his jaw, the way his throat moved when he swallowed. "Your move," she said, voice barely a whisper. "Is it?" But he wasn't looking at the cards anymore. The wind howled louder, and something crashed against the side of the cabin. They both jerked back, the moment broken. Jake went to check the walls while Margaret stared at her cards without seeing them. What was happening to her? This was Jake Garrison, outlaw and killer. She should fear him, despise him. Instead, she found herself noticing the way he moved, the careful way he tended the fire, the gentleness in his hands when he'd cleaned a cut on her face that first night. "Wall's holding," he reported, returning to his seat, but he didn't pick up his cards. "Margaret, there's something I need to tell you." Her stomach clenched. "About the robbery. About why I chose that particular shipment." He stared into the fire, jaw tight. "The gold wasn't just any gold. It belonged to Hamilton Sterling." The name hit her like a physical blow. Hamilton Sterling, the cattle baron who owned half the territory, the man who'd foreclosed on dozens of families, including your family's farm. She breathed. He nodded slowly. "Took me 10 years to track down where his money moved, how he transported it. This shipment was going to set him up with new operations in Denver. 20,000 in blood money, earned off the backs of families like mine. So it was revenge. Justice." His voice turned hard. "Men like Sterling don't face justice in courts. They own the judges, the lawmen, the whole system. Only way to hurt them is to take what they value most." Margaret thought of all the families she'd known who'd lost everything to men like Sterling. Her own parents had barely scraped by, always one bad season away from losing their small ranch. And the money? What happens to it? Gets distributed. Families who lost their lands, widows trying to keep their children fed, old folks turned out with nothing. He met her eyes. "That's why my men follow me. Not for the thrill or the easy money, but because sometimes the only way to balance the scales is outside the law." "A Robin Hood of the desert," he laughed, but it was bitter. "Hardly. I'm no hero. Margaret, I've done things, killed men who were just doing their jobs, following orders. There's blood on my hands that won't wash clean." "Then why tell me?" "Because I think you understand. You've seen how the world really works, how the powerful grind down everyone else. Your husband—" "Don't!" The word came out sharper than intended. "Thomas was weak, not evil. He didn't deserve what happened, but he brought it on himself. And you? Did you deserve to be left with nothing, scorned by the town, forced to scrub floors to survive?" The wind gusted harder, sending more sand streaming through the cracks. The fire flickered, casting wild shadows. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter. though the chill she felt had nothing to do with temperature. "I survived," she said simply. "You did more than that. You kept your dignity, your strength. Do you know how rare that is? Stop." "Stop what? Stop trying to make me into something I'm not. I'm just a woman trying to get by." He leaned forward, intensity radiating from every line of his body. "You're so much more than that. When I saw you that first day, standing up to me when everyone else cowered, I thought—" "What?" The word was barely a breath. "I thought maybe I'd finally found something worth more than revenge." The confession hung between them like a living thing. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. She should say something, should pull back, should remember who they were and why this was impossible. Instead, she reached out, her fingers brushing the back of his hand where it rested on his knee. "Jake," he turned his hand over, catching hers, and the touch sent fire through her veins. For a long moment they sat frozen, hands clasped, the storm raging around their small shelter. Then, slowly, he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm that was reverent and hungry all at once. "Tell me to stop," he said against her skin. "Tell me this is madness." "It is madness," she whispered, but she didn't pull away. He drew her closer, his free hand coming up to cup her face. She could see the question in his eyes, the last chance to turn back from this precipice. Instead of retreating, she leaned in, closing the distance between them. The kiss was inevitable as the storm, wild and desperate and absolutely wrong. She tasted coffee and whiskey, felt the rasp of stubble against her skin, lost herself in the heat of him. His hands tangled in her hair, pins scattering, and she made a sound that might have been his name. When they finally broke apart, breathing hard, the world had shifted on its axis. "Margaret," he said roughly, and there was wonder in his voice. She pressed her fingers to her lips, still feeling the burn of him. "This doesn't change anything. You're still an outlaw. I'm still perfect," he finished. "You're perfect." "I'm practical," she corrected, trying to find her footing again. "And practical women don't fall for dangerous men." "No? Then what do practical women do when they're trapped in a cabin with a dangerous man during a sandstorm?" She should have pulled away completely, retreated to the far side of the cabin. Instead, she found herself smiling. They beat him at poker, apparently. He laughed, and the tension eased slightly. They returned to their card game, but everything had changed. Each casual brush of fingers as they dealt cards sent sparks through her. The space between them hummed with possibility and danger in equal measure. The storm raged on, sealing them in their own private world. And Margaret Sullivan, practical widow who'd sworn never to let another man close, felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble like sand. The news came with dawn, carried by one of Jake's men who'd tracked them to the cabin. Clem Hawkins was a grizzled veteran of countless raids, but his face was grave as he delivered his report. "Bounty hunters. Boss. Led by John Stark himself. They hit Murphy's place, got him to talk. Know about the woman." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. John Stark was legendary, a former Pinkerton man who'd turned freelance, hunting men for profit with ruthless efficiency, if he was after them. "How many?" Jake asked, already checking his weapons. 8, maybe 10, and boss." Clem hesitated. "Sheriff Watson's with them. Deputized the whole bunch." "Of course he did." Jake's smile was sharp as a blade. "How far behind?" "Day, maybe less. They're following your trail hard." Jake turned to Margaret. "Get your things. We leave in 10 minutes." But Margaret was already shaking her head. "No." Both men looked at her in surprise. "No," she repeated more firmly. "I'm tired of running. Tired of being forced from one situation to another with no say in my own fate. Margaret, this isn't the time." "When is the time, Jake?" She stood, squaring her shoulders. "When do I get to choose? You saved me from one fate only to drag me into another. Now Stark is coming, and we'll run again. And then what? How long before the next pursuer, the next close call?" Would you prefer I'd left you to hang? I'd prefer to have a choice. The cabin fell silent except for the crackle of the dying fire. Clem shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing he were elsewhere. Jake studied her for a long moment. What do you want, Margaret? The question she'd been avoiding for days. What did she want? Safety? That was an illusion. Respectability? That ship had sailed the moment she'd ridden out of Redemption Creek with him. Love? The thought terrified her more than any bounty hunter. I want... She paused, gathering courage. I want to stop being afraid. I want to stop letting others dictate my life. And I want... What? His voice was soft now, dangerous in its gentleness. I want to know if this is real. She gestured between them. Or if I'm just another conquest, another thrill for the great Jake Garrison. Clem cleared his throat. Boss, we really should. Wait outside, Jake ordered without taking his eyes off Margaret. When they were alone, he moved closer, and she fought the urge to step back. 3 days in this cabin had stripped away pretense, leaving something raw and honest between them. You think you're a game to me? He asked quietly. Aren't I? The defiant widow who dared to challenge you? You were never a game. He reached out, fingers ghosting along her jaw. You were a revelation. Do you know what it's like, living the way I do, taking what I want, leaving nothing but dust and regret? Then you stood there in that street, warned me I'd regret tangling with you, and I thought... What? I thought maybe you were right. Maybe I would regret it, but not for the reasons you meant. His thumb traced her cheekbone. I'd regret it because you'd make me want things I can't have, a life I gave up on years ago. Jake, I'm no good for you. Margaret, I'm everything your mother warned you about and worse. But if you ask me if this is real... He pulled her against him, and she went willingly, her hands splaying against his chest. This is the most real thing I've felt in 10 years. She should pull away, should remember all the reasons this was impossible. Instead, she rose on her toes and kissed him, pouring all her confusion and longing into the connection. He responded immediately, arms tightening around her, lifting her slightly off her feet. When they parted, both breathing hard, reality crashed back. They're coming, she said unnecessarily. Yes, we can't outrun them forever. No. He set her down gently, but kept his arms around her. Which is why I need to ask you something. Do you trust me? Did she? This outlaw who'd disrupted her life, who'd shown her tenderness and violence in equal measure. Yes, she realized with surprise. God help me, but yes. Then I need you to do exactly as I say. No questions, no arguments. Jake, you said you trusted me. She nodded slowly, though unease prickled along her spine. He called Clem back in. Change of plans. Take Mrs. Sullivan to the old Destry mine. Wait for us there. Boss, the rest of the boys meeting us at Devil's Canyon. As planned. Yeah. Good. Jake strapped on his gun belt. Movements efficient despite his still healing shoulder. I'll lead Stark there. When the dust settles, bring her to meet us. No, Margaret protested. I'm not leaving you to face them alone. You're not. I'll have my men. He cupped her face in his hands. This is my fight. Margaret, has been since the day Sterling destroyed my family. But I need to know you're safe to finish it. And after? When it's finished? Something flickered in his eyes. Hope, perhaps, or pain. After, you'll have that choice you wanted. Stay or go. No obligations, no debts. Just choose. She wanted to argue, wanted to demand he take her with him. But she saw the wisdom in his plan. She'd be a liability in a gunfight, a distraction he couldn't afford. Promise me, she said fiercely. Promise you'll come back. He kissed her instead of answering, deep and desperate, like a man saying goodbye. Then he was gone, mounting his black stallion and riding hard toward whatever fate awaited at Devil's Canyon. Clem helped her onto a spare horse, and they rode in the opposite direction, toward the abandoned mine shaft Jake had mentioned. The old man was surprisingly gentle, keeping the pace manageable and pointing out landmarks along the way. Known Jake since he was barely more than a boy, Clem said conversationally as they rode. Wild as a Mustang even then, but with a good heart buried deep. Hasn't let many see it these past years. Why are you telling me this? Because you got him thinking about after, ain't heard him talk about after in, well, maybe never. The old outlaw spat tobacco juice. Man like Jake don't usually believe in after, too busy staying alive in the now. They reached the mine as storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Not sand this time, but rain, the first Margaret had seen in weeks. The shaft entrance yawned black and forbidding, but Clem led her to a small shack nearby, hidden by overgrowth. Used to be the foreman's office, he explained. Got supplies cached here, you'll be comfortable enough. How long do we wait? Clem's weathered face was carefully neutral. Till they come or till they don't. Way it always is. Thunder rumbled overhead as the first fat raindrops began to fall. Margaret stood in the doorway of the shack, staring toward Devil's Canyon, though she couldn't see it from here, somewhere beyond those hills. Jake was riding into a trap, using himself as bait to draw Stark away from her. He's survived worse, Clem offered, reading her thoughts. Jake's got the devil's own luck. Everyone's luck runs out eventually. Maybe, or maybe he finally found something worth changing his luck for. The rain came harder, turning the desert into a sea of mud. Margaret retreated into the shack, but her thoughts remained with a dark-haired outlaw who'd kissed her like she was his salvation and rode away like he was already a ghost. She pressed her fingers to her lips, still feeling the burn of that final kiss. He'd promised her a choice when this was over, but what good was choice without him? What good was freedom if it meant being alone again? The storm gathered strength, lightning splitting the sky. And Margaret Sullivan, practical widow who'd never believed in prayer, found herself whispering words into the wind, begging any power that might be listening to bring him back to her. Because somewhere between that first defiant, "You'll regret this," and his whispered, "You were a revelation," she'd done the one thing she'd sworn never to do again. She'd given her heart to a dangerous man, and now all she could do was wait in this ramshackle shelter while the storm raged, hoping against hope that Jake Garrison's luck and hers would hold for just a little longer. The news came with a lone rider at dawn. 3 days after Jake had ridden away, Margaret recognized him as Davis, one of the younger members of the gang, and her heart sank at his grim expression. "They got him. Ma'am, Stark's men. Ambush went bad." The world tilted. Margaret gripped the door frame to keep from falling. "Is he alive? For now. They're taking him back to Redemption Creek for trial." Davis shifted uncomfortably. "Hanging set for tomorrow? Sunset?" "No." The word came out as a whisper, then stronger. "No? Where are the others?" "Scattered. Henley's dead. Clem took a bullet to the leg. Boss ordered us to disperse before they got us all." Margaret's mind raced. Jake had sacrificed himself to save his men, just as he'd sent her away to keep her safe. But she'd be damned if she'd let him hang for it. "How many guards?" Davis blinked at her tone. "Ma'am, how many guards will be with him?" 6, maybe 8, plus Stark himself. But ma'am, you can't be thinking, I'm thinking Jake Garrison saved my life. I'm thinking he deserves better than a rope." She turned to Clem, who'd been silent throughout the exchange. "You know the town, know the jail. Is there a way?" The old outlaw studied her with new respect. "Might be, but it'd take someone on the inside, someone they wouldn't suspect. Someone like a widow returning home to clear her name. Margaret, no." Davis stepped forward. "Boss would never forgive us if... Jake's not here to object, is he?" She was already forming a plan, wild and desperate but possible. "I'll need a horse, and that medical kit from Jake's saddlebags." "What are you planning?" She thought of Jake's smile, his laugh, the way he'd held her during the sandstorm. "I'm planning to give him that after he talked about, one way or another." The ride back to Redemption Creek was the longest of her life. Every mile brought new doubts, new fears, but also new determination. She'd spent 2 years living in fear, accepting whatever scraps life threw her way. Jake had shown her she could be more, want more. Now it was time to prove it. She entered town at midday, dusty and travel-worn, playing the part of the desperate woman perfectly. People stared as she made her way down Main Street, whispers following in her wake. The widow Sullivan, back from her scandalous flight with the Outlaw. Sheriff Watson was in his office, feet up on his desk, looking insufferably pleased with himself. His eyes widened when she walked in. "Mrs. Sullivan, heard you'd run off with Garrison." "I was taken against my will," she said, letting her voice tremble. "When the shooting started, he grabbed me as insurance. I only escaped when your men ambushed him." Watson leaned back, studying her. "That's so? Funny. Word was you two seemed mighty cozy." "People see what they want to see." She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "I'm just grateful to be home. Though I heard, is it true? Will he really hang tomorrow?" "True enough. Judge came through yesterday. Held the trial without him even being there. Guilty on all counts." Watson's smile was ugly. "You planning to watch, considering your involvement?" Margaret let herself shudder. "I'd rather forget any of this happened, but—" She hesitated, then pulled out a small bottle from her bag. "My mother's medicine. For pain. I thought even condemned men shouldn't suffer unnecessarily." Watson examined the bottle suspiciously. "What are you playing at?" "Christian charity. Sheriff. Nothing more." She met his eyes steadily. "Unless you think a small mercy makes me a criminal too?" He wavered, then shrugged. "Suppose it can't hurt. He'll be dead soon enough anyway." Margaret left the sheriff's office and made her way to the jail. Each step measured despite her racing heart. The guard at the door was Simmons, who'd always been sweet on her despite her married status. She played to that now, smiling sadly. "Hello, Robert. I heard about the prisoner. Mrs. Sullivan." He straightened, smoothing his hair. "Didn't expect to see you here." "I needed to see him. To ask why." She let tears well in her eyes. "I know it's foolish, but I need to understand why he involved me in his crimes." Simmons melted at her tears, as she'd known he would. "I shouldn't, but I suppose a few minutes wouldn't hurt." Stark's at the saloon anyway, celebrating. The jail was small, only 3 cells. Jake was in the furthest one, sitting on the narrow cot with his back against the wall. His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, but he was alive, beautifully, wonderfully alive. He looked up as she approached, and his good eye widened. "Margaret, what the hell are you—" "Hush." She glanced back at Simmons, who stood by the door trying to give them privacy while still maintaining watch. "I brought medicine for your pain." Understanding flickered across his face as she held up the bottle. He took it, their fingers brushing, and she pressed a small folded paper into his palm along with it. "Drink it all," she said loudly enough for Simmons to hear. "It'll help you sleep." Jake read the note quickly, then met her eyes. She saw the protest forming and spoke first. "You were right," she said softly. "I do regret it, all of it." The words were for Simmons, but her eyes told Jake a different story. "Trust me." They said, "Please, Margaret, goodbye, Mr. Garrison." She turned away before her composure could crack, walking past Simmons with her head high. "Thank you, Robert. I needed that closure." Outside, she forced herself to walk normally, though every instinct screamed at her to run. The next hours would be critical. She made her way to the boarding house where she'd stored her few possessions before fleeing with Jake. Mrs. Perkins, the proprietress, clucked over her like a mother hen. "Such a terrible ordeal, you poor dear." Margaret played her part, accepting tea and sympathy while watching the clock. The laudanum she'd given Jake would take effect soon, slowing his breathing and pulse until he appeared near death. The note had explained the rest. At 4 o'clock, right on schedule, commotion erupted from the direction of the jail. Margaret rushed to the window with the other boarders, watching as Simmons ran for the doctor. Word spread quickly. The prisoner had collapsed, possibly poisoned himself. "Doctor!" Hartley emerged from the jail 20 minutes later, shaking his head gravely. Margaret heard him tell Sheriff Watson that Garrison was barely alive, might not last the night. Watson cursed colorfully, furious at being cheated of his hanging. "Move him to the doc's office," Watson ordered. "If he's gonna die, I want witnesses he wasn't murdered in custody." "Perfect, Doctor." Hartley's office backed onto the alley where Clem would be waiting with horses, in the confusion of moving a seemingly dying prisoner, in the growing darkness of evening. There would be a moment. Margaret slipped out of the boarding house and made her way to the arranged meeting spot. Davis was there with the horses, looking nervous. "You sure about this, ma'am?" "I'm sure." She checked the gun Jake had taught her to use during their time in the cabin. "Be ready to ride hard." The procession emerged from the jail, Jake on a stretcher, carried by 2 deputies, Watson and Stark following close behind. Jake played his part perfectly, limp and unresponsive. As they neared the alley, Margaret stepped out of the shadows. "Sheriff Watson, there's a fight at Murphy's. They need you." Watson hesitated, torn between duty and the prisoner. That moment of distraction was all Jake needed. He rolled off the stretcher, more alert than any dying man should be, and grabbed the nearest deputy's gun. Chaos erupted. Jake shot Stark in the shoulder, sending the bounty hunter spinning. Margaret fired at the other deputy's feet, making him dance backward. Clem appeared with the horses as planned. "Margaret, go!" Jake shouted, covering their retreat. She was already mounting, adrenaline singing through her veins. Jake swung up behind her, and they spurred the horses into motion. Gunfire cracked behind them, but the falling darkness was their friend. They thundered through the streets, scattering townsfolk, and burst out onto the open prairie. They rode hard through the night, changing horses at a spot Clem had prepared. Only when the sun began to rise did they slow, miles and miles from Redemption Creek. Jake pulled their horse to a stop beside a stream, sliding down and helping her dismount. For a moment, they just stood there, breathing hard, the reality of their escape sinking in. "You came back for me," he said wonderingly. "You saved me first." She touched his bruised face gently. "We're even. Margaret Sullivan, you magnificent, terrifying woman." He pulled her against him, kissing her with desperate relief. "You drugged me. You orchestrated a jailbreak. You shot at lawmen. You'll regret this," she said against his lips. But she was smiling. The outlaw only smiled back, wider and more genuine than she'd ever seen. "Never. Not for 1 second." They stood there by the stream, outlaws both now, with the whole territory likely to be hunting them by noon. Margaret knew she should be terrified. Instead, she felt free for the first time in her life. "What now?" she asked. "Now?" Jake tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Now we disappear. California, maybe. Or Oregon. Somewhere we can start fresh. Together. If you'll have me. I'm not much of a bargain-wanted man with a price on his head. I'm a woman who just broke a condemned prisoner out of jail. I'd say we're well matched." He laughed, the sound rich and full of promise. "That after I talked about? This is it, Margaret. You and me and whatever comes next. If you're willing." She thought of the life she was leaving behind. The loneliness, the struggle, the weight of others' judgment. Then she looked at Jake, battered but unbowed, offering her a future as uncertain as it was full of possibility. "I'm willing," she said simply. And as the sun rose over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Margaret Sullivan left her old life behind without a single regret. 6 months had passed since that desperate flight from Redemption Creek. Margaret stood at the window of their small ranch house, watching the California sun paint the hills gold. They'd made it, across deserts and mountains, through territories where their faces adorned wanted posters, all the way to this quiet valley where no one knew their names. Jake had kept his promise. The stolen gold had been distributed through Clem's network to families Sterling had destroyed. Then Jake Garrison had disappeared, and in his place stood James Gardner, rancher and husband to the former Margaret Sullivan, now Margaret Gardner. The transformation hadn't been easy. Some nights, Jake still woke reaching for his guns. Some mornings, Margaret still expected to find their idols shattered by lawmen at the door. But slowly, carefully, they'd built something real from the ashes of their old lives. "You're thinking too loud again." His arms came around her from behind, and she leaned back against his solid warmth. The scars from his wounds had faded to thin white lines, but she could still trace them in the dark. "Just remembering," she said softly. "Regrets?" She turned in his arms, seeing the vulnerability that he still only showed to her. "Never. You?" "Only one," at her raised eyebrow. He continued, "I regret it took so long to find you." "Flatterer." But she smiled, reaching up to touch his face. The hard edges had softened these past months. Peace looked good on him. A rider appeared on the horizon, and they both tensed. Old habits died hard. Then Margaret recognized the horse and relaxed. "It's just Ben from town." Ben Martinez ran the general store and had become their closest friend, one of the few who didn't ask questions about their past. He dismounted with a grin, holding up a letter. "Mail for you folks, from back east." Jake took the letter, frowning at the unfamiliar handwriting. Inside the house, they read it together, Margaret's heart sinking with each word. It was from Sheriff Watson. Stark had survived and was still hunting them. Worse, Big Jack Thornton had put up his own bounty for Margaret, claiming she owed him for Thomas's debts. The letter was a warning. Watson had apparently had a change of heart. Or perhaps Clem had paid him enough to develop one. "We need to leave," Jake said immediately. "Tonight. I know a place in Oregon." "No." He looked at her in surprise. "Margaret, no more running." She stood, pacing to the fireplace where a small fire crackled. "We've built something here, Jake. A life, friends, a future. I won't let them take that away. They'll come here eventually. Then we'll face them when they do." She turned back to him, fierce determination in her eyes. "Together." Jake studied her for a long moment, then smiled slowly. "You know what you're saying? If we make a stand here, there's no going back. James and Margaret Gardner will have to disappear too. Then maybe it's time to stop being anyone but who we are." She moved to him, taking his hands. "I'm tired of pretending. Jake, tired of looking over my shoulder. If they come, they come, but I won't give up this life without a fight." He pulled her close, pressing his forehead to hers. "You'll regret this," he said, echoing her old warning. The outlaw only smiled. She whispered back, completing their private joke. They spent the next weeks preparing. Jake taught Margaret to shoot better, faster. They fortified the ranch house subtly, creating defensive positions. Their neighbors, sensing trouble without knowing its source, quietly offered support. It seemed the Gardners had made more friends than they'd realized. The confrontation came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the letter. Margaret was feeding the chickens when she saw the dust cloud. Multiple riders, moving fast. She gave the signal, 3 sharp whistle blasts, and Jake emerged from the barn, rifle in hand. But as the riders grew closer, Margaret gasped. It wasn't Stark or Thornton's men. It was Clem, Davis, and 3 other members of Jake's old gang. "Boss," Clem said as they reined in, grinning through his grizzled beard. "Heard you might need some help." "How did you—" "Watson sent word to us too. Figured if there was going to be a fight, we ought to be here for it." Davis nodded to Margaret. "Ma'am, good to see you again. But your lives," Jake started, "ain't worth much without loyalty." Clem interrupted. "You saved every one of us at some point. Time to return the favor." They didn't have long to wait. 2 days later, Stark arrived with 8 men. An hour after that, Big Jack Thornton himself rode in with another dozen. They made camp just outside rifle range, clearly planning to wait them out. 20 men, Jake said grimly, plus Stark and Thornton. 6 of us, Clem added. 7 counting Mrs. Margaret, 8. They turned to find Ben Martinez loading a shotgun, flanked by 2 other townsmen. "This is our fight," Jake protested. "You're our neighbors," Ben said simply. "In this valley. That means something." By evening, their numbers had swelled to 15 as more neighbors arrived. Not gunfighters, most of them, but solid people willing to stand for what was right. Thornton sent a messenger at sunset. "Give us the woman and half the stolen gold, and we'll let the rest of you live." Jake shot the man's hat off his head. "There's your answer." The attack came at dawn. Gunfire erupted from all sides as the outlaws tried to rush the ranch. But Jake had positioned his defenders well, and the attackers found no easy victory. The battle raged through the morning, neither side able to gain clear advantage. Margaret fought alongside the men, her aim true and steady. When Davis took a bullet to the shoulder, she dragged him to safety and bound the wound without missing a beat. This was her home, her life, and she'd defend it with everything she had. The turning point came when Stark, impatient with the standoff, tried to circle around to the blind side of the house. Jake was waiting. The 2 men faced each other in the dusty yard, hands hovering over their guns. "Been a long chase, Garrison? It ends here, one way or another." They drew simultaneously. 2 shots cracked as one. Stark spun and fell. Clutching his chest, Jake remained standing, though blood seeped from a graze on his ribs. Seeing Stark fall broke the attacker's resolve. Thornton, faced with determined defenders and mounting casualties, called for retreat as quickly as it had begun. The battle was over. "We did it," Margaret breathed, hardly believing. "We did." Jake pulled her close, mindless of his wound. "Think they'll be back?" Clem spat tobacco juice. "Doubt it. Thornton's a businessman. This cost him too much for one woman's supposed debt." As their neighbors tended wounds and cleared away the battle's debris, Margaret found herself standing once again at the window where this day had begun. But now, instead of uncertainty, she felt only peace. "Any regrets now?" Jake asked, joining her. She thought of the journey that had brought them here, from a dusty street in Redemption Creek to this golden valley in California. The widow who'd warned an outlaw he'd regret tangling with her, and the outlaw who'd only smiled in response. "Just one," she said. His eyebrows rose. "Oh?" "I regret it took us so long to realize we were meant to find each other." He laughed, spinning her around. "Margaret Garrison." "Gardner," she corrected. "I've grown fond of the name." "Margaret Gardner. Then, have I mentioned lately that I love you?" "Not since breakfast." "Shameful oversight." He kissed her soundly, there in their bullet-scarred kitchen, with the sun setting over their hard-won peace. Later that evening, as their friends celebrated victory and life, Margaret stepped out onto the porch. The stars were beginning to appear, diamonds scattered across purple silk. Somewhere out there, Redemption Creek went on without them. Sheriff Watson would find other outlaws to chase, the gossips would find other scandals to whisper about. But here, in this valley where they'd made their stand, Jake and Margaret Gardner had found something worth more than gold or reputation. They'd found home, and as Jake joined her on the porch, pulling her back against his chest to watch the stars emerge, Margaret smiled. She'd been right that day in the dusty street. He had regretted tangling with her, regretted all the years he'd lived without her. But the outlaw had only smiled, and in that smile, she'd found her future. The past was done. The running was over. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but they'd face them as they had today, together, unafraid, and without a single regret. In the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon, wild and free. Margaret closed her eyes and listened, feeling Jake's heartbeat steady against her back. Somewhere in that sound was an echo of their own journey, dangerous and uncertain, but ultimately leading them exactly where they needed to be. Home. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale from. Please share in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more romantic adventures from the American frontier. What did you think of Margaret and Jake's journey? Share your thoughts. I'd love to hear which part touched your heart the most.